In the winter of 1963, on a particularly chilly December morning, a young black girl named Rose made her way through the bustling corridors of Mount Sinai Hospital. At just 12 years old, she often accompanied her mother to work, especially during school breaks when staying home alone wasn't an option. Her mother, Mrs. Thompson, worked as a nurse's aide, taking the early morning shifts that nobody else wanted. Rose loved these hospital visits. The stark white walls, the squeaky clean floors, and the constant movement of doctors and nurses fascinated her. But today would be different. Today would change her life in ways she couldn't imagine. As she walked past the nursery window, something caught her attention. Among the rows of newborns, most sleeping peacefully in their clear bassinets, one baby was crying inconsolably. The infant's face was red from crying, tiny fists waving in the air. Rose pressed her nose against the glass, watching as two nurses tried unsuccessfully to calm the crying baby. Without thinking, Rose knocked gently on the window. One of the nurses, Mrs. Parker, who knew Rose from her regular visits, came to the door. "Is everything okay with that baby?" Rose asked, genuine concern in her voice. The nurse sighed, looking exhausted. "We've tried everything. Sometimes babies just need to cry it out." Rose fidgeted with the hem of her dress, gathering courage before speaking. Could I maybe try holding the baby?" The words tumbled out before she could stop them. Mrs. Parker's eyebrows shot up in surprise. In 1963, the idea of a black girl holding a white baby was almost unheard of, especially in their part of the city. The nurse hesitated, looking around the empty hallway. The hospital had strict rules about who could enter the nursery, and more unspoken rules about race that everyone understood, but nobody discussed openly. But the baby's persistent crying and her own exhaustion made her consider the unusual request. "Wait here," Mrs. Parker said, disappearing back into the nursery. She returned moments later, after consulting with her colleague. "You'll need to wash your hands thoroughly and wear a clean gown." Rose nodded eagerly, following the nurse's instructions precisely. Inside the nursery, the baby's cries seemed even louder. Rose approached cautiously, her heart pounding with nervousness and excitement. Mrs. Parker carefully lifted the crying infant and, after one final moment of hesitation, placed the baby in Rose's arms. What happened next stunned everyone in the room. The moment Rose cradled the baby, the crying stopped. Not gradually, but immediately, as if someone had flipped a switch. The infant's eyes, still wet with tears, opened and seemed to focus on Rose's face. A tiny hand reached up and grabbed her finger. The nurses exchanged astonished looks. They had been trying for hours to soothe the baby, yet this young girl had managed it in seconds. Rose began humming softly, a lullaby her grandmother used to sing to her, gently swaying back and forth. The baby's eyes started to close, peaceful sleep finally taking over. "I've never seen anything like it," whispered the second nurse, Miss Wilson, watching the scene unfold. "It's like magic." Rose barely heard them, lost in her own world with the baby. Something felt different about this moment, special in a way she couldn't explain. It was as if an invisible thread connected her to this tiny being in her arms. When it was finally time to put the baby back in the bassinet, Rose felt a strange reluctance to let go. "Can I come back tomorrow?" she asked hopefully. The nurses, still amazed by what they had witnessed, found themselves nodding despite hospital protocols. As Rose left the nursery that day, she couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary had just happened. She didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning of a story that would unravel family secrets, challenge societal norms, and prove that love knows no boundaries. Walking home that evening with her mother, Rose couldn't stop talking about the baby. But she noticed something odd. Her mother's usual warm responses were replaced with short, distracted answers. When Rose mentioned how natural it felt holding the baby, Mrs. Thompson dropped her bag, spilling its contents across the sidewalk. As they picked up the scattered items, Rose caught a glimpse of her mother's face. There was something there, worry, fear, whatever it was, it only added to the mystery that had begun in that hospital nursery, a mystery that would soon change everything Rose thought she knew about her family. That night, as Rose lay in bed, she couldn't get the baby's face out of her mind. She didn't understand why, but she felt drawn to return, to hold the infant again, to protect and care for this tiny stranger who had somehow touched her heart. Little did she know, this was just the first chapter in an extraordinary tale that would unfold in the days to come, revealing truths that had been buried for years. The next morning couldn't come fast enough for Rose. She barely touched her breakfast, eager to return to the hospital with her mother. The winter sun was just peeking through the clouds when they arrived, and Rose's heart skipped a beat as they walked through the main entrance. This time, she didn't even have to knock on the nursery window. Mrs. Parker was already there, waiting with a warm smile. "I had a feeling you'd be back," she said, holding out a clean hospital gown. "Someone's been fussy all morning." The sound of crying from inside the nursery confirmed her words. As Rose entered the nursery, she noticed more staff members than yesterday had gathered to watch. Word had spread about the young black girl who could calm the inconsolable white baby. Some faces showed curiosity, others skepticism, but Rose paid them no attention. Her focus was entirely on the crying infant. Just like the day before, the moment Rose held the baby, the crying ceased. The infant's blue eyes fixed on her face, and a tiny hand reached up to touch her cheek. Rose started humming the same lullaby, and soon the baby was cooing contentedly. "It's remarkable," whispered one of the doctors who had come to observe. "We've tried everything. Different formulas, checking for illness, even bringing in specialists. Nothing worked except—" He gestured toward Rose, clearly amazed. Over the next few hours, Rose learned more about the baby. The nurses told her how the infant had been left at the hospital 2 weeks ago, with just a note asking for the child to be cared for. No name, no family history, just a tiny bundle wrapped in a pale yellow blanket. "We've been calling her Hope," Miss Wilson shared, "because that's what we're holding on to. Hope that she'll find her family." The name struck a chord with Rose. Hope, it felt right somehow, as if the name had been waiting for the baby all along. As the days passed, Rose's visits became a regular part of the hospital routine. She would finish her homework sitting beside Hope's bassinet, telling the baby about her day at school, about her dreams, and about the world outside the hospital walls. The staff grew used to seeing the young girl in her clean hospital gown, holding the baby who would cry for anyone else. But something was changing at home. Rose noticed her mother becoming increasingly distant. Mrs. Thompson would make excuses to leave the room whenever Rose talked about Hope. She started taking different shifts at the hospital, ones that kept her away from the nursery during Rose's visits. One afternoon, while Rose was feeding Hope her bottle, she overheard 2 nurses talking in hushed tones. "Have you noticed how much the baby looks like?" one began, before the other quickly shushed her. When they saw Rose watching, they hurried away, leaving her with questions she couldn't quite form. The mystery deepened when Rose's grandmother came to visit. Usually warm and talkative, Grandma Betty became oddly quiet when Rose excitedly told her about Hope. Later that night, Rose heard muffled voices from the kitchen, her mother and grandmother in what sounded like an intense discussion. "She needs to know," her grandmother's voice carried through the thin walls. "The truth has a way of coming out, child. Better it comes from you than—" "Not now," her mother's voice was firm but trembling. "She's too young to understand." Rose lay in her bed, trying to make sense of the fragments she'd heard. What truth were they talking about? What did she need to understand? And why did her heart feel so connected to a baby she'd known for just a few days? The next morning, Rose noticed something she hadn't before. As she held Hope near the nursery window, the early morning light streaming in, she saw it. A tiny birthmark behind the baby's ear, shaped like a crescent moon. Her hand instinctively went to her own ear, where an identical mark had been her grandmother's favorite thing to kiss since she was a baby. Her mother had always said it was a family trait, passed down through generations. But that would mean... Rose's mind raced with possibilities, each more overwhelming than the last. The whispered conversations, her mother's strange behavior, the familiar birthmark, pieces of a puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they formed seemed impossible. As she placed Hope back in her bassinet, the baby grabbed her finger, holding on tight, as if trying to tell her something. Rose knew then that her connection to this tiny, abandoned infant wasn't just chance. There was more to this story, much more, and somehow she was part of it. Looking down at Hope's sleeping face, Rose made a silent promise. She would figure out the truth, no matter what it took. Little did she know, the answers would shake her world to its very foundation, revealing secrets that had been buried for years and testing bonds she thought unbreakable. With the baby finally asleep, Rose sat in the quiet nursery, watching the rise and fall of Hope's tiny chest. Outside, the winter sun was setting, casting long shadows across the floor. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more mysteries to unravel. But for now, in this peaceful moment, Rose felt certain of one thing: she was exactly where she needed to be. The mystery surrounding baby Hope deepened over the next few days. Rose couldn't shake off the discovery of the matching birthmark, and her mind kept returning to the whispered conversations she'd overheard. The hospital had become a place of both comfort and questions, each day bringing new clues to an increasingly complex puzzle. One particularly cold morning, Rose arrived earlier than usual. The halls were quieter at this hour, with only the night shift staff finishing their rounds. As she approached the nursery, she noticed Dr. Williams, the chief pediatrician, deep in conversation with Mrs. Parker. They were looking at some papers, their faces serious. The blood type matches, Dr. Williams was saying. And the timing. He stopped abruptly when he saw Rose, quickly tucking the papers into his coat pocket. Both adults gave her strained smiles before hurrying away, leaving Rose with another piece of the mysterious puzzle. Later that day, while Rose sat in her usual spot next to Hope's bassinet, she overheard two cleaning ladies talking just outside the nursery door. 15 years ago, that's when it happened, one was saying. Right here in this very hospital. The Thompson girl. They moved out of Urshet before Rose could hear more, but her heart was already racing. Thompson, that was her family name. Rose began paying closer attention to everything around her. She noticed how some of the older hospital staff would look at her and Hope with knowing expressions. She caught fragments of conversations that stopped when she walked by. Even Miss Wilson, usually so chatty, seemed to be keeping something from her. The most telling moment came when Rose was looking through an old photo album at home. Hidden between the pages, she found a faded hospital bracelet dated 15 years ago. When her mother caught her looking at it, Mrs. Thompson snatched it away so quickly she knocked over a vase of flowers. "Mom," Rose had said, gathering courage, "I need to know what's going on. Why does Hope have the same birthmark as me? Why do people stop talking when I come near? What happened 15 years ago?" Her mother had frozen, color draining from her face. "Not now, Rose," she'd whispered, her voice shaking. "Please, not now." But Rose could see the tears forming in her mother's eyes, could feel the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. That night, unable to sleep, Rose crept downstairs for a glass of water. She heard her mother on the phone, speaking in hushed tones. "She's asking questions, Mama. She's seen the birthmark. What am I supposed to tell her? How do I explain what happened back then?" The next day at the hospital, Rose noticed something different about Hope. The baby seemed more alert than usual, her blue eyes following Rose's every movement. As Rose held her, something struck her about those eyes. They were the exact same shade as the old photograph she'd seen of her mother as a young woman. During her visit, Miss Wilson came in to check on Hope's temperature. As she wrote in the chart, Rose caught a glimpse of the papers. There was a birth date from 2 weeks ago, but also a reference to another date, 15 years earlier. Before she could read more, Miss Wilson pulled the chart away. Rose spent that afternoon in the hospital library, searching through old newspapers. She wasn't sure what she was looking for until she found it, a small article from 15 years ago about a baby born at Mount Sinai Hospital. The article was brief, mentioning only that the infant had been given up for adoption. The mother's name had been withheld, but Rose's heart told her what her mind was struggling to accept. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture that seemed impossible yet increasingly true. Hope wasn't just any abandoned baby, she was connected to Rose's family somehow. But how? And why had she been left at the same hospital 15 years after that first mysterious birth? As Rose held Hope that evening, studying the tiny face that had become so dear to her, she felt the weight of all these questions. The baby gurgled happily, grabbing Rose's finger with surprising strength. In that moment, Rose made a decision. She would find out the truth, no matter what it cost. She didn't know then that the answer would come sooner than she expected, and that it would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone around her. The truth was there, waiting to be discovered, hidden in medical records, whispered conversations, and the unmistakable similarities between a 12-year-old girl and an abandoned baby. As the sun set outside the nursery window, casting long shadows across the floor, Rose held Hope close, humming their special lullaby. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more clues to unravel. But for now, in this quiet moment, she felt closer than ever to understanding the bond that had drawn her to this tiny baby from the very first day. Little did she know, the biggest revelation was yet to come, and it would shake the foundations of everything she thought she knew about her family, her history, and herself. The truth began unraveling on a quiet Sunday afternoon when Rose's grandmother came for her weekly visit. Usually, these visits were filled with stories and laughter, but today was different. There was tension in the air as Grandma Betty settled into her favorite armchair, watching Rose with careful eyes. "Your mother tells me you've been spending a lot of time with a baby at the hospital," she began, her voice unusually serious. Rose nodded, noticing how her mother suddenly became very interested in folding laundry across the room. "Tell me about this baby," Grandma Betty said softly, patting the seat beside her. Rose sat down and began describing Hope, the birthmark, the blue eyes, the way she stopped crying only for Rose. With each detail, her grandmother's expression grew more troubled. "Child," she finally said, "there's something you need to know. A story from long ago that we've kept hidden, thinking it was for the best." Mrs. Thompson dropped the shirt she was folding, but Grandma Betty held up her hand. "No, daughter, it's time." And so the story came out, piece by piece, like a delicate puzzle being assembled. 15 years ago, Rose's mother had worked at the same hospital, but as a young cleaning staff member. She had fallen in love with a young doctor doing his residency, a white man named David. In those days, Grandma Betty explained, her voice heavy with memory, their love was forbidden. Mixed relationships could cost people their jobs, their families, everything. Rose listened, her heart pounding as the story unfolded. Her mother had become pregnant, but David's family threatened to have her fired and make sure she never worked in healthcare again if she kept the baby. They had already arranged for him to marry someone from their social circle. "Your mother made the hardest decision of her life," Grandma Betty continued. "She gave the baby up for adoption to a family who could give her everything we couldn't. But she made sure it was a closed adoption. No one could ever know." Rose's mother finally joined them, tears streaming down her face. "I went back to school after that," she said quietly. "Became a nurse's aide. I thought I could make up for it somehow by helping other mothers and babies." "But what does this have to do with Hope?" Rose asked, though in her heart she already knew the answer. Her mother took a deep breath. "David, he married the woman his family chose. They had a daughter, Hope's mother. When Hope was born 2 weeks ago, she was left at the hospital with a note. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was David's." The revelation hit Rose like a wave. Hope wasn't just any abandoned baby, she was her niece. The same blood that flowed through Rose's veins flowed through Hope's. The connection she had felt from the first moment suddenly made perfect sense. David's daughter had Hope out of wedlock, her mother explained. His family, they're still the same. They wanted to hide it, just like they hid what happened with me. History repeating itself in the cruelest way. Rose sat in stunned silence, processing everything. The whispered conversations, the knowing looks, the shared birthmark, it all made sense now. Her mother had lost one baby to society's prejudices, and now her granddaughter faced the same fate. "That's why you've been avoiding the nursery," Rose said softly. "It reminded you of what happened back then." Her mother nodded, unable to speak through her tears. Grandma Betty wrapped an arm around both of them, holding them close. "But we can't let it happen again," Rose said suddenly, sitting up straight. "We can't let Hope go through what that first baby did. We're her family, maybe not the way people expect, but we're still family." The words hung in the air, heavy with possibility and fear. Mrs. Thompson looked at her daughter with new eyes, seeing not just her 12-year-old girl, but a young woman with wisdom beyond her years. "It won't be easy," her mother warned. "People will talk. They'll judge. Some might even try to stop us." "Let them talk," Grandma Betty said firmly. "We've spent too many years letting other people's prejudices control our lives. That baby needs her family, her real family." As the winter sun set outside their window, the 3 generations of Thompson women sat together, planning and dreaming. They knew the road ahead would be challenging, but they had something stronger than society's rules. They had love, truth, and each other. Rose went to bed that night with her mind racing. Tomorrow, she would go back to the hospital, look into Hope's eyes, and know that this wasn't just a strange connection between a girl and an abandoned baby. This was family finding its way back together, healing old wounds and creating new beginnings. The truth had finally come out, but this wasn't the end of the story. In many ways, it was just the beginning. The real challenge would be what they did with this truth, how they would fight for hope, and whether they could create a future different from the past. The next morning dawned bright and cold, but inside Mount Sinai Hospital, things were heating up. Rose arrived early with her mother, both of them carrying a different kind of energy after yesterday's revelations. The truth about hope had changed everything, and today they would begin the process of making things right. Dr. Williams was already waiting for them in his office, his face serious as he looked through a stack of papers. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, "I've been reviewing the records from 15 years ago." He paused, glancing at Rose. "And the recent tests we ran on Hope. The birthmark got me thinking," he continued. "So I had the lab rush some tests. The DNA results came back this morning." He spread several papers across his desk, pointing to highlighted sections. "There's no doubt about it. Hope is related to your family." Rose watched as her mother's hands trembled while reading the results. The scientific proof of what they already knew in their hearts was overwhelming. The doctor explained how the genetic markers showed the connection, confirming that Hope was indeed her mother's granddaughter. "But there's more," Dr. Williams said, pulling out another file. "Hope's mother, she left a letter with the baby that was supposed to be opened only if a blood relative was found." He handed the sealed envelope to Mrs. Thompson, who stared at it for a long moment before opening it. As she read, tears began rolling down her cheeks. The letter was from David's daughter, explaining how she'd learned about her father's past, about the baby he'd forced someone to give up. She wrote about how she couldn't bear to do the same thing to her own child, but her family was pressuring her to hide the pregnancy, to give up the baby just as had been done before. "I left her at Mount Sinai, hoping someone would make the connection," the letter read. "Hoping that somehow the grandmother she never knew might find her way back to her family." The room fell silent as the weight of these words settled over them. Rose reached for her mother's hand, squeezing it tightly. Dr. Williams cleared his throat, clearly moved by the situation. "There's something else you should know," he said. "The adoption papers haven't been processed yet. Legally, there's still time for family to claim Hope." He looked directly at Mrs. Thompson. "As her biological grandmother, you have rights." The next few hours were a whirlwind of meetings with social workers, hospital administrators, and legal representatives. Rose sat through it all, watching as her mother transformed from a quiet nurse's aide into a fierce advocate for her family. Questions came from all directions. Could a single mother support another child? Would the racial dynamics of the situation cause problems? How would they handle the inevitable gossip and judgment from others? But Mrs. Thompson had answers for everything. She had saved money over the years, always feeling somehow that she might need it one day. Their house had an extra room. Grandma Betty lived nearby and could help with childcare. And as for what people might say, well, they'd survived worse. The social worker, a kind-faced woman, listened to everything carefully. "Times are changing," she said thoughtfully. "Slowly, but they are. What might have been impossible 15 years ago? Well, maybe now is the time to make things right." While the adults handled the paperwork, Rose slipped away to the nursery. Hope was awake, cooing softly in her bassinet. As Rose picked her up, she felt different. This wasn't just the baby she'd formed a mysterious connection with anymore. This was her niece, her family, a chance to heal old wounds and create new beginnings. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered to Hope. "Somehow you knew we belonged together." The baby grabbed her finger, holding on tight, as if to say yes. Miss Wilson came in, her eyes shining with tears. "I've been here since your mother was young," she said softly. "I remember everything that happened back then. To see things coming full circle like this," she shook her head, smiling. "It's like a miracle." Later that afternoon, as the sun began to set, Dr. Williams gathered everyone in his office again. He held up a stack of papers, now complete with signatures and official stamps. "It's preliminary," he said, "but it's done. Hope can go home with you as soon as she's cleared by the pediatrician. Rose watched her mother cover her face with her hands, overwhelmed by emotion. This was really happening. The baby that had drawn her to the nursery day after day was coming home with them. The family that had been broken 15 years ago was finding a way to heal. As they left the hospital that evening, Rose took one last look at the nursery where it had all begun. Something that had started as a simple act of kindness, trying to comfort a crying baby, had led to this moment, this revelation, this reunion of family across generations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, hope wasn't just a baby's name. It was a feeling filling their hearts, a promise of better days ahead, and a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful endings come from the most painful beginnings. The days following the revelation were filled with a whirlwind of preparations and emotions. The Thompson household buzzed with activity as they got ready to welcome their newest family member. Rose helped her mother transform the spare room into a nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow and setting up the crib that Grandma Betty had stored in her attic for all these years. But not everything was smooth sailing. Word spread quickly through their small community about what was happening at Mount Sinai Hospital. Some neighbors who used to greet them warmly now crossed to the other side of the street. Rose overheard whispers at school, caught glimpses of pointing fingers and disapproving looks. One afternoon, while Rose and her mother were shopping for baby supplies, they ran into Mrs. Peterson, one of the most influential women in their church. She stopped them right in the middle of the store, her face pinched with disapproval. "I hear you're taking in that baby," she said, her voice carrying so others could hear. "Don't you think it would be better for everyone if she went to a more suitable family?" Rose felt her mother stiffen beside her, but Mrs. Thompson's voice remained steady. "Hope is my granddaughter," she said clearly. "There is no family more suitable than her own." She took Rose's hand and walked away, head held high, leaving Mrs. Peterson standing open-mouthed among the baby bottles. Back at home, though, Rose found her mother crying in the kitchen. "Maybe they're right," she whispered. "Maybe I'm being selfish. What kind of life can I give her in a world that's still so full of prejudice?" That's when Grandma Betty arrived, as if she could sense she was needed. She took one look at her daughter and pulled up a chair. "Let me tell you something about prejudice," she said. "I've seen it all my life, but I've also seen love triumph over it, time and time again. That baby needs love more than she needs a suitable family." The next challenge came from an unexpected source. David himself appeared at the hospital, looking older and grayer than in the photograph Rose had seen. He stood awkwardly in Dr. Williams' office, his eyes unable to meet Mrs. Thompson's. "My family," he began, then stopped, clearing his throat. "They think this isn't right. They're worried about scandal, about what people will say." He finally looked up, his face lined with years of regret. "But I spent 15 years being a coward. I won't do it again. Whatever you decide about Hope, I'll support you. It's time I did the right thing." His words seemed to lift a weight from the room. Mrs. Thompson didn't speak, but she nodded, acknowledging the courage it had taken for him to come. Rose watched this exchange, understanding for the first time how much pain both adults had carried all these years. As the day of Hope's homecoming approached, more surprises emerged. Miss Wilson organized a collection among the hospital staff, presenting them with a beautiful wooden rocking chair. Dr. Williams arranged for a pediatrician friend of his to provide free checkups for Hope's first year. Even some of their neighbors began to come around. Mrs. Clark from next door brought over a handmade quilt. "My grandmother made this for me when I was born," she said. "I've been saving it, but I think Hope should have it now." The night before they were to bring Hope home, Rose couldn't sleep. She crept downstairs to find her mother sitting in the new rocking chair, staring out the window at the moon. "Are you scared?" Rose asked, sitting at her mother's feet. "Terrified," her mother admitted with a small smile. "But you know what? I'm also excited. For the first time in 15 years, I feel like I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to do." Rose leaned her head against her mother's knee. "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" "More than okay," her mother said, stroking her hair. "We're going to be family, all of us, exactly as we should have been all along." That night, as Rose finally drifted off to sleep, she thought about how much had changed since that first day she heard a baby crying in the nursery. Tomorrow, Hope would come home, and their real journey would begin. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing worth doing ever was, but they would face whatever came together. The moon shone through her window, casting a gentle light across the room, and Rose smiled, thinking how sometimes the best families aren't the ones that look suitable to others. They're the ones that love finds a way to bring together, against all odds and expectations. The day Hope came home was bright and clear, a perfect spring morning breaking through the last remnants of winter. The Thompson house, freshly cleaned and decorated with welcome banners made by Rose, was ready to receive its newest family member. Mrs. Thompson stood in the hospital parking lot, holding the car seat with trembling hands. Rose walked beside her, carrying a small bag of Hope's things from the nursery. As they approached the entrance of their home, neighbors began emerging from their houses. The Thompsons held their breath, unsure what to expect. Mrs. Clark stepped forward first, holding a casserole dish. Behind her came other neighbors, each carrying something: home-cooked meals, baby clothes, toys. Even Mrs. Peterson was there, clutching a hand-knitted blanket and wearing an expression that seemed to say she was trying to understand. "We may not understand everything," Mrs. Clark said, speaking for the group, "but we know what family means. And we know love when we see it." Inside, Hope settled into her new home as if she'd always been meant to be there. The yellow nursery glowed with sunlight, the rocking chair from the hospital staff placed perfectly by the window. Grandma Betty sat in it, holding Hope while Mrs. Thompson organized the gifts and Rose gave everyone a tour of the baby's room. But the real changes came in the weeks and months that followed. The Thompson house became a different place, filled with baby laughter, midnight feedings, and the kind of joy that only comes from healing old wounds. Rose discovered she had a talent for making Hope laugh, creating silly faces and songs that would stop the baby's tears instantly. David became a regular visitor, slowly building a relationship with a granddaughter he'd almost lost. He brought books and toys, but more importantly, he brought stories about his daughter, Hope's mother, and about the mistakes he'd made. "I can't change the past," he told Mrs. Thompson one evening, "but I can help make the future better." The community's attitude shifted too. What had started as whispers of scandal transformed into admiration for the strength of a family that chose love over convention. Other families with similar stories began reaching out, finding comfort and courage in the Thompsons' example. 1 year later, on Hope's first birthday, the house was packed with people celebrating. Hospital staff mixed with neighbors, family friends with new supporters. Hope, now walking and babbling, tumbled from person to person, spreading joy with each wobbly step. Rose watched it all from the porch steps, remembering that first day in the nursery when a crying baby had somehow known they belonged together. Miss Wilson sat down beside her, smiling at the scene. "You know," she said, "in all my years of nursing, I've never seen anything quite like this. You started something bigger than just finding your family, Rose. You showed people that love doesn't have to follow anyone else's rules." Inside, Mrs. Thompson was showing Hope's baby album to some guests. The first page held 2 photos side by side, one of Rose holding Hope in the hospital nursery, and one taken just yesterday of them playing in the backyard. The resemblance between them, the shared birthmark visible in both pictures, made people smile in understanding. Grandma Betty joined Rose on the porch, wrapping an arm around her granddaughter. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the best families are the ones that life surprises us with. We just have to be brave enough to recognize them when they come along." As the sun began to set on Hope's first birthday celebration, Rose thought about how much had changed in just 1 year. The baby who had been abandoned was now surrounded by more love than anyone could have imagined. The family that had been broken was now stronger than ever. Mrs. Thompson brought Hope out to join them on the porch, and they sat together watching the sky turn pink and gold. Hope reached for Rose's hand, grabbing her finger just like she had that very first day in the nursery. Some things, it seemed, never changed. "You know what?" Rose said, looking at her family gathered around her. "I think this is exactly how things were always meant to be." Her mother smiled, tears shining in her eyes. "Yes," she agreed, "this is exactly how it was meant to be." As night fell and stars began appearing in the sky, the Thompson house glowed with warmth and light. Inside, a family that had been brought together by chance, courage, and love continued celebrating, proving that sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones that don't follow the expected path. And somewhere in that celebrating house was a birth certificate, finally complete with all the names and dates that told the true story of how a 12-year-old girl's hospital visit had led to healing not just one family, but an entire community's understanding of what family really means.